Almost went bad. I'm one of the pastors here at Horizon Church. We are continuing a story. We're continuing a message series into the book of Genesis, and I just want to start with letting you know that this story this week has really touched me in a deep and profound way. My biggest struggle in life is the need to control everything around me. Don't laugh. If you know me, I don't know why you're laughing. I'll trust God when I can no longer control it and hold it all. But by that time, I'm pretty exhausted and empty, and everything has honestly already fallen apart. This causes me to live a life that's often frustrated and angry, resentful and fearful, exhausted and confused. And then I hide it by overfunctioning and overcompensating so everyone around me thinks I have it all together. I just want people to see me as a real life shero, right? So I can be everything to everyone, and somehow I think that will make people be more faithful servants of God. But I'm not the hero here. God is. And that was what was revealed to me in our story that we're about to read. And that sets me free to live my life different. So if you're sitting here holding on to the pieces of your life as hard as you can, I hope you hear some hope in today's story. You don't have to grip so tight anymore. You're not the hero of your story. And that frees us up to live a life where joy and peace, happiness and goodness are a little more easy to come by. Let's let God be the hero, and let's live life more free and fun. I'm going to read to you Genesis chapter 16, and we're going to kind of go through this verse by verse. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. You'll remember last week that Abram and Sarai were given this mighty promise of God, God's only hope. He's put all of his investment into Abraham, making a nation of people who will serve him, right? And he says to Abram, if you do what I say, I'm going to give you children. Just know this is the promise. I'm going to give children unto you. And literally at least a decade, and probably longer than that, Sarah and Abram had still borne no children. But Sarah takes this as an important time to take things into her own hands because she has an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children, so go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarah. And Sarah said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. May God decide who's right in this. And Abraham says, your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. And then Sarah mistreated Hagar. So Hagar left from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will have too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He'll live in hostility toward all of his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. She looked at God and said, you are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. I don't know what your Bible reading pattern is, but we just read an entire chapter of the Bible together. So you started this week in a very good way. You read an entire chapter of the Bible with us this morning. So thank you for that. I just want us to take a moment to recognize that many of us are not born into blank slates. Instead, we are born into messes, and so often we get swept up in the chaos, right? Many of us can look back at pieces of our lives and recognize that you didn't create a mess, but you sometimes got thrown into them. And how you learn to survive that chaos becomes a pattern for the way you live your life in the future until you can begin to create new habits or ways of life. This is our pattern of living life, right? We try to control things. We take matters into our own hands. Things don't go the way we think it should. So fear takes over. Then we blame and push people away. And then we isolate ourselves away from the world. Does anybody here recognize this pattern of your life? Don't raise your hand. We know. We know who you are. We take matters into our own hands. Fear takes over. What if this might happen? We create the worst scenario that could ever happen, and then we blame the people around us for the misery we're living in. We push them away, and we live our lives isolated and lonely. This pattern has consequences, right? It hurts other people. It betrays them. It exploits them. And we create and are involved in and swept up in this chaotic mess. This pattern is clearly revealed in today's story, right? This is not a simple kids' Bible story that we're teaching over in Horizon Kids. This is a Bible story meant for people who are living in the midst of chaotic messes. It is within the first 12 pages of the Bible. Within the first 12 pages of the Bible, this is not some story found after God has created a perfect world and writes about how it's going to look and everything's perfect. This is a story written in the first 12 pages of our story that teaches us who we are and how we respond. We take matters into our own hands. Fear takes over. We blame and push people away, and then we isolate. In our culture, we're often told as we wait for things that we need to take matters into our own hands. You're stuck because you're refusing to move. I want you to hear me this morning. I'm not championing for inaction here, but Sarah is left in quite a dilemma, right? She has waited for 10 years for God to move. Does anybody know what that feels like? To wait for years for God to move. Some of you in this room, like me, know what it's like to spend months trying to have children and you cannot experience that. You know what it's like. You know what it's like, and you try to take matters into your own hands in all kinds of ways. I've been there. For those of you that haven't been there personally, you've walked alongside friends or couples who've done that. We know what that feels like, but that's not the only place in life where we try to take matters into our own hands. Think about how your career has been. Think about the family dysfunction that you experience in your own family. Think about how you operate with your friends or the people around you. Think about what happens when you've been asked to wait and what you do. You need to know, as your pastor, if you've been waiting for 10 years for something, I might tell you it's time to look at a different way. There have been times in the last 2 years of my life, I have looked at Chris as we have waited for a bowling alley to be renovated, and I've said there might be a different way. I have taken matters into my own hands, and I have messed things up. Ask a board who's helped me clean up administrative messes I've created, right? This is not a story that I'm standing up here telling you just about Hagar and Sarah and Abraham. It is our story, and all of us have one. You can think of some situation in your life in the past week where you have taken all matters into your own hands. And then fear, when we are not running on all cylinders, this doesn't happen, right? Sarah doesn't make this decision when all the promises of God are before her. Abraham has been taken outside of his tent. He's shown the stars in the sky, and he says, your descendants will be like this. And the next month comes and Sarah still doesn't have a baby. She's like, Abraham, I don't think you're listening right? She keeps listening. She keeps trying with God. Sarah doesn't make a decision to take matters into her own hands in the perfect Garden of Eden where there's everything she could ever want at her disposal. She makes this decision in desperation, in pain, in grief, and in heartache. And some of you are sitting here this morning in the midst of pain, in the midst of heartache, and in the midst of grief. Your life is a mess, and you have waited on God for about as long as humanly possible. And then what happens? We cut God out of our conversation, and we make poor decisions. You think about what's next, and you do so without a quiet time with God in the morning. You do so without prayer. You do so without a small group. You do so without spiritual friends that you can ask for things. This is the kind of life we start making decisions in. Sarah doesn't go to her friends and say, I don't know what to do. We have no account of that. What we have is Sarah saying, I'm sick and tired of this. I'm taking matters into my own hands. And so, if I just wonder what would have happened if she would have just stopped in the midst of that. Because in the midst of fear, I don't know about you all, but I put my life into overdrive. I start doing 900 things, adopting 500 dogs, just figuring out all the different, I don't have 500, we have one because I have a husband who's like, we're not adopting any more dogs, Erica. But this is what we do when fear starts to take over. We just put our lives in overdrive. And I wonder if this story isn't telling us to stop in the midst of it and to feel the pain and the heartache. And instead of pushing people away, to reach out. If you'll listen, Abraham speaks. He says, Sarah, this is actually your fault. It's not my fault. You figure out what's going on. Did y'all hear Abraham say that to Sarah? Sarah says, Abraham, this is your fault. God's going to judge you, dude. This is awful and terrible. But who didn't speak? Who didn't speak in the midst of all this? Hagar, who's at the center of all of the mess, right? I wonder what it would have been like if Sarah, instead of trying to control everything on her own, would have taken the time that she had built in. I am not a proponent of slavery. Do not hear this, but she had a companion beside her in Hagar, and she treated her like a person less than instead of a friend willing to help. And then she exploited her and betrayed her. And I wish that was a story written thousands of years ago, and it's not one that we do anymore, but so many of us are involved in relationships that are transactional for us, and we don't look at people as humans, but we look at them as what we can get from them. We do this, and some of us are sitting in here as victims of that same kind of lifestyle, right? Somebody has looked at you and not seen you as Katie or Cassandra or Ebony, but they've seen you as a person who acts as a stone to get to the next place that they want to go. What do we do with a story like this in the first 12 pages of the Bible, where there is no solution? Right? Abraham and Sarah, we don't have this magic moment where God intervenes in their life and tells them to act differently and to apologize for what they do. Instead, we have a God who meets the person who's been abused and hurt in the desert, in the wilderness. Y'all, she didn't go out to the desert and wilderness expecting to find a spring. She went out in the desert and the wilderness because she had no place else to go. And in the first 12 pages of the Bible, something I missed until this week, God doesn't show up to Moses at the burning bush first. That's not the first person who gets to see God. The first person who got to see God was not Abraham. He hears God. The first person wasn't even Adam and Eve who saw God. They again hear God. The first person in the recorded word of God that we have that sees God is an enslaved woman. Talk about no rights. Talk about hopeless and desperate. Talk about exploited and abused. Talk about empty and feeling absolutely worthless. That, in the first 12 pages, this is our story. That's the first person who sees God. I think there's a reason this is the first part. That we would experience and even participate in cycles that hurt people. And some of us are sitting here with the guilt and shame of that, and the only thing we can do is pray that God will see the people we've hurt. And some of us, because of being in this cycle, find ourselves as the Hagar stuck out in the desert and saying, I have no idea what's next. And I want you to hear who the real hero in this story is. It is God. My favorite part of this story is not that Abraham and Sarah are the heroes of this story. Abraham, who God has put all of his investment in and says, Abraham, you're the only horse I'm betting on. I need you to win this race. I need you to do these things so that the promise of me can come alive in your nation. That's not who we see being a faithful hero in this story. We don't see Sarah saving the world by creating whatever. She can't save the story. She's not the hero. They mess up. We don't see evidence of life change in this story. And still, God goes to Hagar in the wilderness and saves her from her pain. We see God in the first 12 pages of the Bible seeing a woman with no power and a pretty terrible story. She is seen by God and she sees him. And I want you to listen to this. The angel of the Lord told her, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? You can find yourself in a lot of places in this story. Maybe you're Abraham, maybe you're Sarah, maybe you're Hagar, and maybe somebody here is this angel. Maybe you are called to show up in the wilderness and say, I see you, I hear you, I know of your pain. Where have you come from? Imagine someone who is running from everything that they see in the lowest moment of their life. Your job is not to judge them or look over them or figure out how to exploit or abuse them, but your job is to look them in the face and say, tell me your story. Somebody in this room this morning is called to be an angel of the Lord, to shine light and ignite change in the deepest and darkest and hardest places of the world. I know. And I'm not bragging on myself because I'm not the hero here. God is the hero. God sent me to a prison full of women, and this was some of their stories. They got caught up in this chaotic messes, and they were both Sarah and Hagar all at the same time. And to just look at them in their face and say, tell me your story. To look at people in hospital beds suffering and hurting and say, tell me your story. To look at people in our workplaces or our schools, look across the table from them and say, tell me your story. Says, I see you. I want to hear from you. You are called, every person in this room is called to be an angel. Some of you are in preschool classrooms. Some of you are in student ministries. Some of you are in nursing or even helping people find a home, right? You're in all kinds of places. You are an angel this week called to look at somebody and say, tell me your story. Where have you come from? And where are you going? And let them tell you the truth. I am running away. I am running away from Miss Sarah, who has mistreated me physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And then maybe you get the chance to say, I see you. Because the angel of the Lord said this to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. And you think having a baby doesn't sound real good in this situation, but she says he'll be a wild donkey of a man. Not a donkey who's been put into submission and serving everybody else, but a wild one who cannot be tamed. He will be wild and free. You get to tell somebody this week that your story is not to be in oppression and lacking freedom, but you get to be wild and free. Because this story would be different in the first 12 pages of the Bible if in the midst of fear and pain, in the midst of oppression and running, in the midst of hiding, if somebody somewhere would have just slowed down. This week, Chris reminded me of a book that John Mark Combs wrote about hurry. What's the name of it, Chris? The something of hurry? It's something about hurry. Yeah. Anyway, in the book it says that to slow down and to wait is the greatest sense of love. In a world that's rushing us through to the next thing, that's trying to teach us to take everything into our own hands, what does it look like to stop, to look around at what God has placed before you and to listen to somebody who doesn't have a voice? What does it look like to hear the powerless? In the midst of your own story, this is world-changing stuff. We're talking about breaking down systems of racism and homophobia, and the list goes on and on and on when we begin to listen to the powerless. But in this story, it tells us it doesn't just break down ages-old issues that we have created as human. It begins to change our personal lives too. Slowing down, having faith and listening to the voice of God among the powerless is the greatest way to become free again. To become free again. It slows us down and allows us to see with a new perspective. I've just got 3 challenges for you this week. Some of you are holding on to your life with everything you have. You've taken matters into your own hands and have devised quite the plan to carry it out. What does it look like this week to live with your hands a little more open? To give God the broken pieces that you can't hold on to any longer anyway? What does it look like to open those hands up and offer it to God? What does it look like to slow down? And perhaps God doesn't come to you in a burning bush or in the middle of the desert in a spring, but perhaps God uses a voice that you've ignored for a long time to speak to you in the midst of the wilderness. Perhaps God uses someone who you've overlooked for a really long time, maybe even someone that you've exploited or abused yourself, and God uses them to speak power and truth into your situation. What does it look like this week for us to be angels? To slow down in the midst of our pain and trying to control our lives and to listen and look for somebody else, because God is a God. We see this in the first 12 pages. God is a God who is rescuing the powerless, who is seeing the unseen, and who is giving hope to the hopeless. And you, my friends, in the midst of whatever it is you are experiencing, can be pushed out of that cycle of chaos and into a new way of living by slowing down and paying attention to the people around you. I'm going to pray for us here at the end. I'm going to start, and then I'm just going to give a moment of silent prayer. There's going to be no noise, and I just want you to offer up to God where you don't see seen, where you have shame or pain for what you've done, and you let God save you. And then ask God, How can I be an angel of yours, seeing and speaking to people who are not seen and are not heard? What does that look like for you this week? I'm going to open in prayer. I'm going to give you just a few moments to spend time in silence with God, and then I'll end with prayer, and we'll have communion. Will you pray with me? God, for the people in these seats who know what it's like to lose control of their lives and to hold on so tightly, I ask you to give us courage and strength to open our hands and give our lives back to you. We ask for forgiveness for all the things we've done when we've held on so tightly to keep in control of our lives. We ask for forgiveness for overlooking and not hearing the powerless and the hurting in our world. And we ask you, God, boldly and in the name of Jesus, for you to create us to be people who see the powerless and the hurting among us. Show us right now who that person is in our life this week. And God, in a world where we feel like we have to be the hero or shero of everything around us, we ask for courage, for strength, for grace, to trust you to be the hero, to trust you to be our strength, to save us, redeem us, and help us walk into a new way of life. God, as the air condition blows, and as we sit here, we just pray that it will be a reminder that your Spirit is here with us. That in the midst of our pain and heartache, in the midst of the things that we've done wrong, in the midst of your calling us to speak into the darkness, God, that you are Emmanuel. And your promise is that you are with us forever and always. And we want to thank you for your Son, Jesus, who came to earth and taught us what it was like to see the least and the lost, the hurting and the betrayed, who showed us that there is indeed a freer and more joyful way to live. We thank you for Jesus, who gave his life up on the cross for us, who experienced the darkness and pain of not being seen and exploited and abused, God, and who showed us the power of a God who is more powerful than that, a God who is more hopeful than that, a God who offers us all new life and promises to redeem us and restore us through Jesus' mighty acts of salvation. Remind us of that power again this morning. And for those of us who've never stepped into that way of life, may this be the morning that we give all the pieces of our broken lives we've held on to too tight back to